The haunting food delivery, a night to never forget. I'll never forget that night. It started off like any other, quiet, uneventful, but it ended in a way I could never have prepared for. I've never been the type to believe in ghosts, but after what happened, I'm not so sure anymore. I just finished an exhausting day of work. The kind of day where all you want to do is collapse into your bed and forget about the world. But as I sat in my small, dimly lit apartment, my stomach growled. The takeout I'd ordered hours ago still hadn't arrived, and I was starting to get irritated. I called the restaurant, but they assured me the delivery guy was on his way. Great, I thought. What else could go wrong? By 9:45 p.m., I heard the familiar sound of my doorbell ringing. I quickly jumped up and rushed to the door, feeling a mix of hunger and frustration. When I opened it, there he was, the delivery guy. Or at least, that's what I thought he was. He was a tall man, wearing a weathered black cap that shadowed his face. His uniform was tattered around the edges, and he looked tired, almost as if he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were hollow, sunken, like he hadn't seen the light of day in far too long. But he smiled when he handed me my food, and his voice was a low murmur as he said, "Enjoy your meal." I took the food and paid him, but something about the way he smiled felt off. There was a blankness in his eyes, an emptiness that made my skin crawl. He didn't linger long. He just turned and walked away without another word. I shut the door behind him and sighed, ready to eat. But then, just as I was about to unwrap my food, I heard a faint knock. Tap, tap, tap. It was soft at first, but it was enough to make me stop. I glanced over at the door, confused. I hadn't heard anyone walk past. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was the delivery guy again? Maybe he forgot something, or I had left something out. I hesitated for a moment before opening the door again, but when I did, there was no one there. I stood in the doorway for a moment, staring down the long hallway of my apartment building. The elevator was at the far end, and I could see the dim light from the stairwell flickering. No sign of anyone, just an empty, cold corridor stretching into the darkness. I shook my head and chalked it up to my imagination. Maybe the wind, I muttered to myself, closing the door with a quiet click. But as soon as I turned around, something felt wrong. I suddenly felt very aware of the silence in my apartment. It wasn't just quiet, it was dead quiet. The usual sounds of traffic, neighbors, and the hum of the city outside had disappeared. Everything had become unnervingly still. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just tired, but then, there it was again. A faint whisper, barely audible, as if it was coming from right behind me. "Help me." I froze. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I spun around, but there was nothing, just my empty apartment. I felt the room grow colder, and my breath became visible in front of me, like I was standing in a freezer. I took a step back, my pulse quickening. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice shaking. There was no answer. Suddenly I heard the knock again. This time it was much louder. Bang, 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 the sound of someone pounding on my door with desperation. I rushed over to open it, but when I grabbed the handle, it wouldn't budge. The door wouldn't open, no matter how hard I tried. Panic set in. I turned the deadbolt, pulled the handle again. Nothing. Then came the voice. "Let me in, please." The voice was unmistakably the delivery guy's voice, but now it was distorted, twisted, like it was being spoken by something other than a human. It had an unnatural, guttural quality to it, full of sorrow and agony. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away from the door. The whispering grew louder. More voices joined in, all begging, pleading for me to let them in. "Help me! Help me! I'm so cold!" I looked around, terrified. The apartment felt like it was closing in on me. The air was thick with a heavy, suffocating presence. And then, just as I was about to lose all sense of control, the door crashed open with such force that it sent me stumbling backward into the kitchen. I looked up and my blood ran cold. There, standing in the doorway, was the delivery guy, only he wasn't the same. His eyes were wide and empty, like black holes sucking in all light. His skin was pale, stretched tight over his bones. He was grinning now, a wide, grotesque grin that stretched far too far, like it was made of pure malice. "Help me," he whispered again, but this time his voice was filled with a horrible, otherworldly rasp. I could barely breathe. The room was freezing, and I could see my own breath fogging up in front of me. He stepped forward slowly, his feet dragging across the floor as though he was struggling to move. And then something happened that I will never forget. The walls of the apartment began to bleed. Dark, thick liquid oozed from the cracks in the plaster, dripping down in slow, grotesque rivulets. The air became thick with a rancid, metallic smell, like death itself was seeping in through the walls. The whispering grew louder, until it was a chorus of tortured souls all screaming for release. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. I could feel the cold, icy fingers of the delivery guy reaching for me, his touch sending waves of pain through my chest. His grin widened even more, splitting his face in a way that made my stomach churn. "Help me," he whispered again, but this time his voice wasn't just a voice. It was the combined wail of thousands of souls, lost and screaming, begging for freedom. And then I understood. The delivery guy wasn't a delivery guy at all. He was a ghost, a soul trapped in the world between life and death, unable to move on. He had been dead for years, and he was cursed to repeat his last moments over and over again, desperately trying to find someone, anyone, who could free him. But no one ever did. With one final horrifying scream, the delivery guy lunged at me. My body snapped out of its paralysis and I bolted for the door, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the handle. But when I opened it, there was nothing. The hallway was empty. The whispers stopped. The blood on the walls vanished. It was as if nothing had ever happened. I collapsed against the door, my heart racing. I couldn't understand it. I didn't want to understand it. But as I looked down at the floor, I noticed something. A small, crumpled receipt stained with something dark, something red. The name of the delivery service was there, but in tiny, faded print at the bottom was a note I hadn't seen before. "In memoriam, John Walker died 10 years ago in a car accident. I've never ordered food again." And now, every time I close my eyes at night, I hear it. The whispering, the desperate pleading. And I know deep down that he's still out there, waiting, always waiting for someone to help him, to release him. But I know better now. I'll never open the door again. Because once you do, you might just invite something inside that will never leave.